So hello everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm going to go through a very interesting video today. It actually covers the first 100 years of the Reformation. And this is a good video, I think, in relation to, it helped me to understand, anyway, making it, how actually a theology based on love actually led to a war and led to a lot of bad feeling. It's a difficult thing to understand until you go into it in some detail, and that's what this video will do. If you'd like to stay with it until the end, you'll get a very clear understanding of why actually a dispute about theology actually led to various different conflicts in Europe back 500 years ago. So to start with, just to give some background, another video has covered this, but actually the first event was in 1517, where Martin Luther put up what's called 95 Theses on a door of a cathedral in Wittenberg. And actually what he was complaining about was that the church was making money from selling indulgences. And Martin Luther was very concerned about this because he believed that you can't buy your salvation. This was an abuse by the church, etc. And this snowballed into a bigger issue over the next couple of years. The church attempted to get Martin Luther to actually retract some of these particular theses. Some of the major bishops said that, and the cardinals of the church pointed out that some of them are contrary to the church theology, etc., the Catholic theology. But Martin Luther actually refused to back down. Over the next couple of years, there was a number of debates in 1518 and 1519. And then in 1520, Martin Luther writes, he actually gives a very clear understanding of the development of his own thought. He's developing a theology known as, over these years, known as faith alone, which is that he begins to believe, he writes a book called in 1520, he writes a book called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And what that basically means is that he believes the church is captured by forces other than forces of Christianity, and that a lot of the actual rituals that the church goes through is actually totally unnecessary. He emphasizes strongly that all that's needed is faith. He writes another book that year as well called The Freedom of the Christian, where he puts a tremendous emphasis on this new theology of his known as faith alone. And he writes another book, which is probably the biggest mistake I would think of his entire career, which is an invitation to the German nobility to get involved. At this stage, it's a couple of years on from 1517, and he begins to realize that he's not going to get the type of reforms that he's pushing for inside the church itself. So what he actually does is he invites the German nobility to get involved in church affairs in each country, but particularly in Germany, in the various, it wasn't a united country then like it is now, but in the various territories of Germany, Martin Luther encourages the nobility of the country to get involved in church reform. And of course, the nobility do get involved, but not because they're totally convinced of the so-called theological breakthrough that Martin Luther believes he has achieved, mainly because they see that the church is an extremely rich institution that owns between 15 and 20% of all German land. Hundreds of billions of pounds worth of land all over Europe. So the nobility get involved primarily for sort of secular reasons, in the sense that there's a tremendous amount of wealth to be achieved. There's also there's a level of nationalism or national independence from the Roman Empire to be achieved, and there's a lot of revenue streams going from Germany through various types of taxes and various different the buying and selling of various different church offices. All of this is drifting towards Rome, and there's a lot of resentment within the nobility about it. So the nobility get on board all right, and there's other examples of this, of course, as the Reformation develops. King Henry VIII in England is a very strong defender of the Pope. In fact, he's given a title for it. And over the 1520s, as he watches what happens in Germany, of course, he becomes part of the reform movement himself, because he sees that there's tremendous wealth and power and greater independence for England to be gained by actually supporting the actual Lutheran reform movement. Another idea promoted by Luther was the idea of Scripture alone, and in his actual sort of discussions with some of the senior bishops, he also outlined the idea that he believed Scripture was vastly superior to the church authority, church councils. He believed he could point to contradictions in various different church councils, and that therefore Scripture was superior to actually the church councils or the Pope or bishops or anybody. So he elevated during these discussions the idea of Scripture being the supreme authority, and it was up to the individual believer to take whatever meaning they wanted from Scripture. He also claimed that most of the sacraments are not really necessary. Pilgrimages, rosaries, all this sort of thing. Condemns a lot of the church activities in 1520. This is just 3 years after he. So at this stage, Luther is actually developing a separate theology, separate from the Catholic theology and separate from the actual Catholic tradition going back centuries. So that by the end of 1520, Luther basically finds himself that he's very much in conflict with the Catholic Church, not just in terms of the practices of the Church, in terms of reform, but also in terms of the theology of the Church. And therefore in January 1521, he's excommunicated from the Church. And a few months later, either May or June, sometime around the middle of the year in 1521, he comes in front of the famous trial, the Edict of Worms, it's known as, and there was a lot of bishops and princes, and actually the emperor himself, Charles V, was in attendance. And during this session, Luther is under pressure to retract some of his books that he wrote the previous year and some of the articles in relation to the 95 Theses, but he refuses to retract anything, and he says something like that his reason and his actual view of Scripture is superior to everything else, and he's not going to actually retract anything. And that sounds very heroic at the time, but it runs into trouble later, which I'll deal with in a few minutes. So in the following year, actually, Luther actually writes his version of the New Testament. He translates the New Testament into actually the German language. And at this stage, he's very convinced of the whole theology of faith alone. And he comes across a verse known as Romans 3:28, which says, "A person is justified by faith apart from works of the law." And Luther translates that by using the word alone after the word faith. And he says, a person is justified, or a man is justified by faith alone. That's not in the original translation. But Luther is so convinced that this is actually the main thrust of the gospel that he actually inserts that word in order to give the meaning of Paul's phrase, emphasis. That's a big discussion in itself. Various different theologians of both faiths have discussed this over the years. And so most of the Bibles actually don't actually include the word alone in the word. Most of the translations don't. I think the Lutheran Bible does still continue to do that, but even the King James Bible dropped the word alone because it's basically a mistranslation on the part of Luther. As well as that, in the mid-20s, 24, 25, there was a huge level of unrest in Germany known as the Peasants' Revolt, and that led to a situation where basically tenant farmers were looking for better rights from landlords and from princes and people like that. And Luther believed he needed the nobility on his side to actually push through the reforms. So when it came to the conflict between the nobles and the peasants, what was known as the Peasants' Revolt or the Peasants' War, took place in a number of places in Germany. Eventually 70,000 people were killed, but in the middle of all this, Luther actually wrote a booklet called Against the Murdering Thieves and Peasants, and so he lost a lot of credibility at that point because he didn't really represent the view of the common people. Everyone knew there was a lot of injustice, as there generally is in terms of the relationship between the nobility and ordinary people. But Luther actually stood on behalf of the nobility because he believed that they were going to enforce his reforms in the following years. The nobility did enforce some of his reforms, all right, but the main thrust of actually the nobility's motivation in this regard was to take over church lands and to increase their own powers and their own revenue streams. So there was actually a lot of support for Luther, but not because on a theological basis. Of course, some of the actual nobles did actually believe in his reforms as well, in a theological sense, but not all of them did, and that's why there's a lot of mixed motives in regard to actually the overall Reformation movement. So by the mid-20s and 25, he gets married, and he also actually writes this book known as The Bondage of the Will. This sets out his theology in relation to his understanding of how people are saved. And what he's basically saying here in The Bondage of the Will is that mankind's will is completely tied to sin. Man can do nothing in terms of their own salvation. It's all the work of God. It's 100% God's work. It's 0% man's work. And he develops this idea, but it's really developed further 10 years later, in the mid-30s, by John Calvin, who develops the whole idea of predestination from the total depravity of the bondage of the will that Luther actually first talks about in the mid-20s. So towards the end of the actual 1520s, in 1529 actually, there was an attempt to bring together the entire Reform movement, in the sense that there was two major branches of it at this stage. Luther was the leader of the Reform movement in Germany, and Zwingli was the leader of a more radical Reform movement in Switzerland, and they attempted to come together to create a common platform in 1529 at Marburg Castle. This was encouraged by the actual prince of the territory, Prince Philip, and of Hesse, and they actually agreed on quite a lot of points. They agreed there was a 15-point program, but they couldn't agree on the Eucharist. As a result of that, Zwingli came to realize that he couldn't rely on external help of any description in order to enforce the Reformed faith on the entire Swiss nation. So he went back to Switzerland with the intention of attempting to bring about the entire country under the Reformed faith. And it was very important at that stage. Switzerland is a country, it's a confederation of various different territories, provinces. They're called cantons. But they have various different military alliances going back for decades, in some cases actually going back for centuries. And so it's a fragile state. It was then, anyway. This is 500 years ago or so. And very powerful enemies on all sides. So these actual various different cantons depended on each other for military support. There was all sorts of understandings of a commercial nature as well. So between military alliances and commercial deals, etc., it was very important that the country was united under a single religion with a single identity. And therefore the Reformation tended to create a lot of fragility within the actual confederation, within the Swiss Confederation. Zwingli attempted to impose his version of the Reformed religion onto the entire country, and he did that by actually encouraging Zurich, the city that he was a big leader in himself, to actually impose food blockades on the rest of the other cantons. But there was a lot of these cantons, very conservative, very Catholic. They weren't prepared to actually move from a centuries-old tradition, a centuries-old religion. As a result, this led to war, and then 2 years later, Zwingli got killed in the Battle of Cabal. And that was actually the first example of where the Reformation movement and the actual confusion and chaos that was caused by the different identities, different religions, different theologies within territories actually creating a situation that led to war between territories. And there was about 700 people killed in that battle, but its significance is that it's the first battle where national security emerged as an issue, and theology basically led to a minor war where 700 or 800 people got killed. It was a small preview, unfortunately, on what was to happen over the following decades and the following centuries. So by the early 30s, the Reformation is beginning to spread all over Europe. It's beginning to affect countries like Spain, France, and even over to England. And in England, Henry VIII had initially been a very strong supporter of the Pope. Actually, in 21, when Luther was at the Edict of Worms on trial, Henry VIII and his Chancellor Thomas More wrote a very famous document, and he was awarded by the Pope with the title of Defender of the Faith, Fide Defensor. So Henry VIII had never really been part of the Reform movement in terms of theology, but he actually recognized, and this is very important to understand in relation to why the actual Reformation gained such massive momentum. It gained a lot of momentum from the nobility in particular, because they recognized that about 15 or 20% of land in Europe, in England, Germany and everywhere else belonged to the church. And the nobility recognized the church really had very little power to hold that land unless they had the support of the nobility. So instead of actually giving the church support, a lot of the nobility, and Henry VIII would be a very good example of this, decided to actually dissolve the monasteries. And in 34, Henry pushed through an act known as the Act of Supremacy, where he took over the leadership of the church, declared himself declared himself head of the actual Church of England. That allowed him to do a number of things. He actually was able to get a divorce because he was actually the head of the church, and he was able to instruct his Archbishop of Canterbury to grant a divorce. And as well as that, then he also had the huge advantage of gaining a greater level of national independence and a lower revenue stream going to the centre of the Roman Empire. And of course, that combined with actually the additional lands that the Crown took over from the church amounted to billions and billions of pounds. And he was also able to actually get a lot of more loyal nobles on his side. So he was able to secure his own position as king, greatly strengthen and enrich himself, and also get out of a marriage that he wanted to actually get out of in order to secure the crown to his son at a future date. So there's a lot of political reasons for actually Henry VIII actually supporting the Reformation, and that's why he changed throughout the 1520s. It was for political reasons, for power reasons, for money reasons, for land reasons. He was also possibly influenced by some of the doctrines of Luther, but the other reasons were the main reasons. And the same actually is true for a lot of European princes and kings. But I'm more familiar with the actual English situation because it's beside us here in Ireland. But that year as well, in 1534, is a very pivotal year really in terms of the Reformation, because that's the year that actually Martin Luther himself produced the actual the Old Testament in German. He translated the actual Old Testament in German. And as he was translating it, of course, he had to look at it, focus at what the Bible was saying in great detail in order to translate it into German. He had to actually think deeply about exactly what the actual words of the text were actually saying. He recognized that some of the books, as he went through the 1520s, some of the books in the Old Testament weren't really in support of his theology of faith alone. There was various books like the Book of Wisdom and the Book of Sirach in particular. These books are all about moral theology, and they're reinforcing the idea of keeping the commandments. If the idea that Luther promoted in his Bondage of the Will in 25, if that was really, really true, that mankind's free will plays no part in their salvation, then all the advice and theological statements in these books would be meaningless. There's also other books like the Book of Judith and the Book of Baruch, which recommended various things like giving alms to the poor. That contributed to salvation, praying for the dead. That's part of the Maccabees, Book 1 and Book 2. So these books that actually contradicted the whole theology that Luther was attempting to develop, he didn't actually remove them from the Bible, but he did downgrade them. He put them into a separate section known as the Apocryphal. They were removed later, but Luther didn't remove them. So a couple of years later, of course, then John Calvin produced a book known as the Institutes of the Institutes of Christianity, or something like that. And he was in 27 years of age at the time, and he's completely influenced by Luther, as if Luther himself was actually writing another gospel. And he's completely taken up with this idea of total depravity that's outlined in the Bondage of the Will in 25 to 10 years earlier. He was only about 16 actually when Luther wrote The Bondage of the Will. So he was a teenager at the time, and he was very influenced by that. And a few years later, his father was excommunicated from the church. So for that reason, Calvin became a very strong supporter of Luther, almost in a very unquestioning way. And throughout the 30s and 40s, he developed the logical follow-on to the idea that human will is totally depraved, and that follow-on would be like that since mankind contributes absolutely nothing to their salvation, according to Luther and Calvin, that means that God chooses people, and that it's 100% God's choice who's going to be saved and who's not going to be saved. This is known as the doctrine of predestination, that some people are born to be saved, other people are born to be condemned. And although it seems now, in retrospect, basically it defies common sense, at the time it was a very strong doctrine, and it gave people who believed they were part of the elect great reassurance that they didn't need to worry too much, that they were part of the elect, part of the Calvinist movement, etc. So that became a very strong movement over subsequent years and decades in various places like Holland and Netherlands, Scotland. It also spread to Scotland, spread to parts of. So in 1534, of course, Henry VIII develops the actual and pushes through Parliament the idea of the Act of Supremacy, and Thomas More is the most famous victim of this situation. Thomas More, known afterwards as St. Thomas More, he rejects the idea that a king should be the head of the church. So he actually loses his life as a result. And lots of people lose their life on both sides. There's a lot of emotion invested in all of this, because people believe that actually different interpretations of salvation is wrong or right or whatever. But Henry VIII actually is a surprising character, although he takes advantage of the Reformation in terms of increasing his own power, increasing his own wealth, and increasing the wealth of the nobility that supports him. He actually is not very theologically convinced in relation to Lutherans' doctrines, and in 1539, just 5 years after the Act of Supremacy, in order to stabilise the English, there's a certain amount of chaos in every country, but in order to stabilise the English situation, Henry VIII produces what's known as the 6 Articles, and these 6 Articles are very, very pro-Catholic in terms of they support the idea of the Mass, they support transubstantiation, they support the continued wearing of vestments by the clergy, they support confession, they support the sacraments, they support priestly celibacy. All of these concepts are all very much pro-Catholic. So I was often thinking, if Henry VIII met Luther around 1539 or 1540, although they both belonged to the Reformed faith, they wouldn't really agree on very much. And Luther would be very much aware that Henry VIII and his chancellor in 1521, when he was on trial, actually wrote a booklet known as The Actual Defence of the Faith, and Henry was awarded a strong title from the Pope as a result of that. So there was very little support for the theological ideas of Luther coming from Henry VIII. But like a lot of the nobility in Europe, he recognised it as an opportunity to take over billions of pounds worth of church land and secure his own position as a stronger leader of the English nobility. So Henry VIII in his final years was very much a Catholic. He actually supported the whole idea of the Catholic religion right through to his death actually in 1547. However, the actual real move towards England moving towards being a reformed country in terms of its religion happened in the actual years subsequent to Henry's death, which was the years 1547 to 53. These were the years of King Edward VI, and Edward VI was only a child at the time. He took over the crown when he was 9 years of age, and he died at the age of 15. So he was never in good health, and he never really it was really the loyal nobility, the great families of the actual, I deal with this in another video actually if you'd like to subscribe. It was actually the actual nobles of the or the royal court, that actually brought about a lot of the actual changes towards moving England towards a more Protestant country. And that was very much in their own self-interest. They wanted to actually consolidate their own gains in terms of thousands of acres of land in some cases. So the Reformation was actually about theology, but it was also about land, it was also about power, it was also about reducing revenue streams going to Rome, either to the centre of the emperor or to the papacy in terms of church, various different types of church revenue streams. So about 40 years after the Reformation started in the mid-50s, there was actually a tiredness. The nobility of Europe was absolutely worn out with various different wars and conflicts, and trying to sort out whether various territories were going to be actually reformed or whether they're going to remain Catholic, etc. This has led to a tremendous level of conflict. So the actual Peace of Augsburg in 1555 was an important stepping stone, in the sense that the leaders of Europe, the various different princes and kings, etc., decided that they would actually decide the actual fate of their own particular territory. That's what this actual accord or this peace treaty was about in the mid-50s. So from this point, it recognised the reality really that the same thing happened in England, but it happened on a very gradual basis, that various different measures were brought in every 5 years or so, and these countries moved from being Catholic to being Reformed or Protestant in a gradualistic basis over a 30 or 40 year period. So these people in these various different countries didn't actually decide to become Reformed, had actually no say in the matter. And this treaty in the mid-50s, 1555, the Treaty of, or the Peace of Augsburg, actually recognises and transfers the powers of what faith a particular territory or country will be to the rulers or government of that particular territory or country. That's an important step as well. And then, of course, a couple of years later in 59, the Elizabethan settlement came about. Elizabeth came to the throne, I think it was in actually 1558, the year before. And she very quickly actually managed to get a settlement which is sometimes called the middle way. It later developed into its own separate, unique type of Christianity known as Anglicanism. Of course, the following century there was a civil war over it, because there was actually, on the Catholic side, there was an attempt to pull the thing back towards Catholicism, and on the other side, of course, the more Reformed tradition, especially the Presbyterians from Scotland and the Puritans, wanted to actually implement greater levels of reform. So that actually ended up in a civil war in the following century, actually. But the Elizabethan treaty actually was actually stabilised the country for several decades, and it did actually bring about a stable situation in England between the two faiths. So the actual Reformation spread into several countries, but no country actually suffered as much as France, because there was almost 40 years of wars from 1562 until 1598, when it was settled by Henry IV. But during that period, there was actually 8 different separate conflicts. It was absolutely dreadful. Millions of people died of famine, directly in the battles themselves, famine and disease that spread as a result, food shortages and all this sort of thing, this massive disruption of the French countryside. And it's estimated that between 2 and 4 million people died as a result of these conflicts. And eventually they came with the actual Treaty of 1598, now the Treaty of Nantes, which is actually a treaty which is actually based on tolerance, and it became a model for in the future for other countries to follow as well, which was basically to give rights even to the minority within the territory. It was believed before that a country had to be either totally Reformed or totally Protestant or else totally Catholic, or it damaged or it undermined the security of the country. That was the belief in Switzerland, for instance, and that's what led to the capital wars in 31. But here in France, of course, several decades later, at the end of the century, we have a situation where they've developed this treaty by the French King Henry IV. He converted himself to being a Catholic to reflect the majority view. that was a kind of a political decision. At one stage he actually said Paris is worth a mass, which is a sort of a cynical comment, but it actually shows that a lot of the nobility, the kings, King Henry VIII was the same. It was more a political calculation about whether they would support the Reformation or not. It was calculation in terms of their own power, their own prestige, the revenue streams that were leaving their territories, and also the confiscation of huge amount of church lands. These were part of the motivations in the case of various different European countries. So it wasn't just about theology, it was also about land, power, nationalism as well. It became a force in the sense that some of these countries, especially Germany and France, and to a greater extent actually perhaps England, wanted to actually demonstrate national freedom, independence from the Roman Empire, and therefore they wanted to achieve independence from the papal system as well. So this was the birth of European nationalism as well, what we're seeing here. So there's a lot of different things that go into this particular range of conflicts that are known as the Reformation, especially in the first century. There's politics, there's power, there's prestige, there's actually land, there's monasteries, there's a whole range of revenue streams, and all these things combine with theology to create numerous conflicts in various different countries. So that's part of my understanding of why there was so many wars, so many conflicts. And of course, actually, that was France, but Britain or England at that time were more fortunate in the sense that had Henry VIII, who was really a Catholic. His son then took over in 47, he was there till 53, and during that time the nobles in the royal court wanted to shift England into a more Protestant direction, because they actually recognised, many of them, that they had been substantial gainers of the land that Henry sold them, the monastery land. So they wanted to secure and consolidate that position, and that was a reflection of what happened in many other countries as well, especially in Switzerland and some of the North countries and some of the German territories as well. There was similar motivations in terms of moving towards the Reformed religion, because it was a way of basically taking over billions of pounds worth of church land. In some of these countries, actually, the land was, in percentage terms, was 15, 17, 20% of the entire land of the country. So you're talking hundreds of billions of pounds worth of land. And that was part of the motivation in the case of an awful lot of the nobility. But there was some of them also, of course, that were genuinely impressed, genuinely convinced by actually Luther's arguments about faith alone. But there was a combination of motivations which also need to be taken into account to fully understand the conflicts in relation to the Reformation.
So Martin Luther died in 1546, and in the following years, in the following decades, there was quite a lot of disagreement among his followers as to exactly what Lutheranism meant. And eventually in 1577 they came up with a document known as the Formula of Concord, which agreed on basic ideas such as original sin, free will, faith alone, the Lord's Supper, and the various different principles of Lutheranism. And this is important. But there still continued to be conflict in Europe, especially between Spain and England, say, in 1588.
And the reason this actual year is of pivotal importance is that the Spanish Armada was actually defeated by the English Navy, Royal Navy, during this year. And this is a very significant event, because there was a lot of rivalry had developed between Spain and England over the years, and the Spanish king was far from impressed with the idea of the actual British monarchy, or the English monarchy at the time, Henry VIII, taking over church lands. Some people actually believe that church lands were sacred lands. They belonged to the monasteries, they belonged to the church. They actually helped to feed the poor. They actually helped various different communities in a lot of different ways. They helped to recruit people who were monks and people who were nuns to work for the church. This was before there was a social welfare system. So there were certain kings who remained Catholic, and Philip of Spain was one of these who wanted to who genuinely believed that the Reformed idea of kings and princes taking over church land and redistributing it among their own friends within the nobility was actually a disaster. And Thomas More in England, of course, actually gave his life in order to avoid Henry VIII becoming the head of the English Church, because he knew that this was kind of a road to disaster. And in the actual 1588, in the Spanish Armada, which was a big effort by that time. There's 130 ships actually involved, and 30,000 men. So it was a big effort, and it was an attempt to take over basically England and reconvert it back to Catholicism. But the entire event failed. The Spanish Armada, there was ferocious storms that were spread all over the place. They failed to link up with the actual Netherlands Catholics that were also Spanish based, and the whole thing ended up a bit of a fiasco. This is a major turning point in the Reformation, in the sense that England went on to become one of the great powerful reformed nations and had a huge influence on the United States in subsequent centuries. So the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is a significant turning point in the Reformation as well. So France was probably the most unfortunate country in Europe during this period, the century following the Reformation, in that there was several conflicts between. First of all, there was the first time there was a major conflict was actually in 1534, where the placards were put up in various different cities around Paris and other French cities, condemning the Mass. And those people were considered radicals at the time. They were very dedicated reformers. Actually, they were condemned by the system. A lot of them were in prison, some of them persecuted in various different ways. So that actually led to Calvin writing his book, trying to explain to the French king 2 years later in 1536 the situation that the reformers weren't really a threat to the state, but the French king Francis still retained a strong Catholic faith himself, and he considered the actual idea of condemning the Mass and the various different ideas that the actual radicals had at the time. He wasn't prepared to go along with it. So the French actual reformers were persecuted for decades in France. However, they became stronger partly as a result of Calvin. Calvin was a very influential guy. He actually left France, went to Geneva about the mid-30s. He wrote that famous book, of course, as well, which had a huge influence in France. It was called the Institutes of Christianity, the Institutes of the Christian Life, I think it was called. And that book was very influential in France. Of course, Calvin himself was from France, but he spent most of his life actually in Switzerland and Geneva. But he still had a huge influence in France. And during the 40s and the 50s, there was continuous conflict in France in various different forms of religious conflict, and reformers had to meet in secret, etc., to have their various different Christian meetings, etc. And these sometimes broke out into major conflicts. And between 1562 and 98, for those 4 decades, there was that 37 year period. There's a tremendous amount of conflicts. Millions of people lost their lives. There was one particular massacre in Paris, Bartholomew's Day, absolute tragedy. Thousands of people were actually killed. It was a real tragedy, the worst of several tragedies in France. In all, there was over 2 million people killed. But eventually it came to a settlement in the peace of, or the Treaty of Nantes in 1598. Here we have a sort of the actual king, King Henry IV. He actually converts over to the Catholic religion in order to maintain his throne. He actually recognizes that So the peace treaty that's actually they've come to in France is actually quite important in 1598. It brings to an end all these various different wars, 36 years or so of wars, millions of people dead, various different famines, etc. The massacre in Paris was absolutely terrible, Bartholomew's Day. So there was absolutely a tremendous amount of suffering done by people on both sides. It was a tremendous tragedy in France. Probably no country suffered as much as France, especially in the first century of the Reformation. But it eventually came to an understanding tolerance, coexistence, that actually, although it was predominantly a Catholic country, that reformers or radicals or Protestants or whatever would have to be given rights. And that was actually the Edict of Nantes brought about by Henry IV actually, that actually brought about that treaty, and he actually converted to being a Catholic himself in order to actually retain the peace and to maintain his own position as the king of the country. So Spain was also impacted greatly as a result of the Reformation. Spain was mainly a Catholic country, but its northern territories, which later became known as the Netherlands, they tended to move towards the Reformed religion. They were greatly influenced by people like Zwingli and John Calvin, and they took a strong Reformed position, and eventually that led to a lot of conflict, a lot of wars between the Netherlands and Spain. But eventually Spain recognized that they came to what became known as the 12 Years' Truce in 1609. And that effectively gave the Dutch Republic semi-independence. And of course, that eventually led to actually Holland, or the Netherlands, becoming independent completely from Spain as a reformed territory. And of course, 1609 is also the year that actually one of the great theologians of the Reformation movement, Arminius, actually died. And the following year, there was a kind of a split within the Netherlands, within the movement, within the Calvinist movement. Arminius was a person who argued strongly for a more moderate tone in regard to predestination, and some of the Calvinist ideas about that free will doesn't exist, there's no such thing as free will, sort of defied common sense to a certain extent. And Arminius actually promoted the idea that there was a lot of truth in some of the Catholic ideas, and therefore that led to a split. That happened in the Synod of Dort in 1618, 1619, where the Calvinists basically officially rejected the Arminian theology, which is very much Catholic in its tone. But they were rejected. 200 ministers lost their positions. That was 1618. This is 100 years on from the actual beginning of the Reformation. And at this stage, the Calvinist movement is beginning to split between Calvinists, strict Calvinists on the one hand, and Arminians, which are sort of semi-Catholic on the other hand. And that actually develops into two different sort of streams of Christianity in future decades and future centuries as well. And of course, it also transfers across the Atlantic to America in subsequent decades and subsequent centuries. And Calvinism tends to decline in the United States, and Arminianism in various different forms, either through the Methodist movement or the various different revivals, emerges in America as a stronger doctrine, a more influential doctrine, because it's not taken up with the idea that there's no such thing as free will. America is a country of independence, a country of personal ambition, a country of where people's decisions and will determines their life here, and therefore it is impossible to promote the idea that free will didn't exist in salvation as well. That goes back to the Lutheran idea of 1525, the bondage of the will. It was taken up by Calvin and promoted and exaggerated further, and his logic and analysis eventually led him to the whole idea: no free will, predestination. Some people are born to be damned, some people are born to be saved. But eventually, basic common sense caused people in virtually every country to reject the extreme elements of this Calvinist idea. So that's it actually for today. I thank you very much for watching. I tried to cover most of the main events of the actual first century of the Reformation. I hope it helped to explain some aspects of the actual history of the Reformation to some people. So thank you very much, and please subscribe if you'd like to see other videos like this. This is Benson, and goodbye for now.